Now, historic preservation, as I practice it, is not something that should stop everything, because it's recognized that for a community to proceed and thrive, that you need to change these buildings. There's new technologies that have been developed, like impact-resistant windows, for example, and the other things that make the buildings more livable than they were when they were built in the teens and the 20s. The key is to have something in place that will let you preserve and go forward with redevelopment in the future that pays attention to and cherishes what we have in the past and keeps it for future generations. As I do this talk, if I have questions, please put your hands up. I will do what I can to answer them as we go along. Mr. Pucillo is going to talk specifically about what the PUD does as far as height and density. I'm going to talk about the historic preservation aspect and what it is we really have here on Royal Poinciana Way.
Well, I'm Michael Pucillo. I'm a member of the Town Council, and I was chair of the Royal Poinciana Way Committee that met for 13 meetings, 57 hours over the course of a year, and made this recommendation back in March. We've been at this now for a year and a half, and the final consideration will be next Wednesday at the Town Council meeting in the afternoon. I want to thank all of you very much for coming here. I'm going to try and explain. The part of it that I will do today is really explain what the PUD 5 would entail as we go through each property. I'll also try and talk a little bit about the current CTS zoning, which Jane referred to a moment ago, and explain what the CTS is. And maybe what I should do is, we've got everybody in one spot here, say a little bit about the existing zoning on the street so everyone knows what that is, and talk a little bit about the PUD 5 as well. We're probably going to spend some time on the Testa property and then move to the west and go down the street, and then probably come up the back side of the street. I hope to have this done in about an hour, hour and a half maximum. If anyone has to leave, I understand. We appreciate your coming. If you've got questions as we go along, don't be reluctant to ask questions, because I want to make sure there is an understanding. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding in the community, and I want to try and dispel some of that. Let me start with the CTS zoning. CTS zoning is this block. It extends up to through Sunrise. Other parts of the street, CTS is commercial town serving. It's been on our code since 1980. One of the things that got me interested in this thing when I started studying the CTS zoning is I realized it's incompatible with the street as we see it, in my view. Everything on this street, except for one property, which we'll talk about when we get there, does not conform to CTS zoning. Everything is non-conforming, except for the bank building. CTS requires 200, for every 200 square feet of retail space, or every 250 square feet of commercial space, one on-site parking space. So, if, for example, this site were developed with 5,000 square feet of retail space, you'd have to have 25 parking spaces here. The code also requires for residential one parking space for, two parking spaces for every single unit. And when you get to 5 units, you have to add an additional spot. So, for example, 5 residential units would require 10 plus 1, 11 on-site parking spaces. So you'll get the picture fairly quickly that if the street were ever redeveloped in the context of CTS zoning, you're going to see a lot of automobiles. You're going to see a lot of parking lots, which was a concern that we had. Now, let's talk a little bit about, well, and let me just say on PUD 5, one of the things we've done is we've said you don't have to have parking for first floor retail spaces. Basically, we've through several provisions in the PUD 5 ordinances, we've eliminated the requirement for first floor retail parking, on-site parking space. So we don't have, the idea is to keep the street as pedestrian friendly, frankly make it more pedestrian friendly and get rid of some of the curb cuts, get rid of the automobiles driving across the street, and have a more pedestrian friendly Main Street. The Main Street character of Royal Poinciana Way was really I think, what everyone wanted to see saved somehow. And our charge was to come up with a way of doing that that provided what I will call reasonable incentives for people to preserve buildings and to develop buildings in a way that maintain the character of the street. Therefore, any new construction under the PUD 5 has to be developed in a manner that is consistent with the existing current architecture. So there are some restrictions. There are some incentives with respect to development in a manner that's consistent with the architecture and preservation of buildings. Those primarily involve parking, the parking abatement for retail. There's one parking abatement for residential, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And at some level, some higher density, which is, of course, something that people have talked quite a bit about. Probably as good a time as any to talk about residential density. CTS allows for 6 units per acre, 6 residential units per acre. PUD 5 allows for 10. There's 2 exceptions to that. One is if you are reducing density down to 13 units per acre from higher numbers. And we're going to see some properties on the street today that have significantly higher density than 13 units per acre. And the other is if you put your parking underground. Why do we care about parking underground? A lot of us don't particularly like underground parking. I don't particularly like it either. But the advantage of underground parking is it takes cars off the streetscape, off the property, and you can substitute, hopefully, pedestrian-friendly space. One of the principal requirements of the PUD 5, and it's a very important requirement, is that you have 30% public open space. That's open space that people can use, people can walk in. And the concept would be on a large tract of land, such as this one. This property owned by the Testas is 1.32 acres. It's the largest contiguous tract of property on the street. The hope is that with 52,000 square feet here, if it's developed, the entire property is developed under PUD 5, you'll see about 15,000 square feet of public open space, which means villas, plazas, courtyards, places where people can gather, as opposed to seeing 25, 30, 40, 50 parking spaces, and essentially a parking lot in addition to whatever else is on the street. So that's one of the hallmarks of the PUD 5 is to try to encourage public open space. The limitations on the size of the building, the footprint of the buildings are essentially the same, 70%, as is the case with CTS, 70% lot coverage here. I see a hand up in the back. The question is, for those who may not have heard it, the water table's been up. How can you put underground parking here? First of all, I'm not going to do it. Somebody else is going to do it. And they're going to make that decision to do it. But let's talk a little bit about that issue. I think on the western end of this street, the water table is too high to do any underground parking. I think realistically, the only place you have a chance of underground parking are perhaps this lot, conceivably the lot to the east of here, although there are other issues there that might make that difficult. Now there's a building behind us on Sunset that we'll see in a few minutes that has an underground parking situation almost parallel to this property. So it has been done in this area. Some might say it has been done in a way that is not particularly attractive. I'm going to try not to be judgmental here, but you'll see that. So there is underground parking here, and obviously whether it is done or not is the decision of the property owner whether they decide they want to do it. The concept of going to 13 units per acre is to give some sort of financial incentive to get people to consider doing underground parking because we'd rather have the cars underground. There's another hand back there.
The Environmental Protection Agency approved it because when they did renovations in the building next door, the gas fumes were so hard that we were forced to move out of the building.
Well, I would think that
people were vomiting, we couldn't have customers in, so how are you going to put a
well,
gas, parking lot underneath here with all those gas fumes?
if that becomes an issue, they're not going to. I mean, right now I'm dealing with the zoning. As I say, I'm trying to make the rules of the game, and I'll let other folks play the game later on.
I have a question. Why don't you just develop Testas and see how nice this is gonna look, and then we might decide on the rest. Why do we have to decide on the whole area? Let's just do this one thing,
Well,
and if we like it, we might go on. If we don't like it, that's it.
It's a good question, and I'm going to give you two answers. One is a legal answer, is that if you make a zoning change for one piece of property, you really do have a spot
There's
zoning
always
situation.
exception. Every house in Palm Beach has an exception.
Well, but in a commercial district, if you pick out one spot and say, we're just going to rezone one piece of property, you're going to have an issue. The other reason is, frankly, as we walk the street today, I hope you'll get a sense that I think the PUD 5, frankly, is of greater advantage to some of the other property owners on the street than Testes. To me, the beauty of the PUD 5 is not so much where we're standing, but some of the older buildings to the west of here that are deteriorating and in my view can be restored intelligently under the PUD 5. So we'll talk about that when we get to those buildings, and if you still have that question, we can talk about it further. Before we go on and we'll walk through, I just want to say a little bit about what I view can be done under PUD 5 and under CTS on this property. Under the CTS, you could bulldoze everything on the Testes site, the entire 1.32 acres. You could put up 8 residential units. You'd have to provide parking. They would have to recapture the existing parking and add some more. If they wanted to have a restaurant anywhere close to the size they have, they would have to have parking. There would be a substantial amount of parking on the Sunset side here. There would be 8 residential units. There would presumably be a restaurant and some retail. Under PUD 5, should they choose to take the underground parking route, which they may not be able to, under PUD 5 they would have to, either underground parking or surface parking, they would have to preserve the urbanistically contributing aspects of that restaurant. There's nothing on this site that we're standing, this gas station, that would have to be preserved. It could be bulldozed. But the front of that restaurant, the patio area and the dining room would have to be saved. And they would essentially have to cut that building and develop around it. But that front would be saved. That's urbanistically contributing. The contributing building report, which Jane Day prepared, and if you haven't read it, I urge everyone to read it, does a very good job of going through each property, detailing them very well. So as we walk through and walk around the restaurant, bear in mind that under the PUD 5, they would not be able to tear that front of the restaurant down. I've got a question.
How about a little talk, a little concise comment on massing and height, which I understand is maybe going to be left a little bit to the developers
Well,
under this plan?
I'm happy to do that. Ned wants me to walk and talk. So the question, for those who didn't hear it, is talk a little bit about massing. Real quick, because Ned wants me to get moving. Real quick, you can go to 2 stories under PUD 5. You can go to 3 stories on non-contributing structures. Okay, sorry about that. You can go to 3 stories on non-contributing structures. Susan, this property we're standing on plus the bank building are the only 2 structures on Royal Poinciana Way that can go to 3 stories. And the 3 stories has to be 35% lot coverage. So it's a much smaller footprint. There are only, I'll repeat that, there are only 2 buildings on Royal Poinciana Way that can go to 3 stories. This property, not the restaurant, just the gas station area, which this is about 120 lineal feet, and the bank, which is 100 lineal feet along the way. You cannot. And what you read in the newspaper today is, I'm glad you asked the question, Susan, because what you read in the newspaper today is absolutely false. You cannot go 5 feet back on an urbanistically contributing building, chop the back of it off, and put a 3rd story. And just so I was clear, I checked with Paul Castro yesterday and made sure he had the same view on this than I do, and he does. The urbanistically contributing buildings cannot go to 3 stories. You can do more in terms of renovating them. You have much more flexibility, but you cannot put a 3rd story on them. Let's move on.
We're standing in the via of Testes Restaurant, and just a little historical background for you. Testes Restaurant was built in 1947. The architect for that building, which is a masonry commercial building, is a fellow named Draper Babcock. He was a draftsman in Addison Meisner's office, but he's not anyone that the Landmark Commission has landmarked any of his buildings in the past. This area here that was all done in the late 1980s by the Testa family. That's when they built the archway that's here. But the open space in this property is something that's very important to everyone and is anticipated in the PUD 5. The restaurant itself breathes very well rather than a lot of the other buildings on the street that go lot line to lot line, and that's a characteristic that under the PUD 5 we would like to save. Now there's two things that are important about this. First of all, as Mike said earlier, under the CTS zoning you could demolish this entire property and redevelop it for whatever the present owners want to do with it. But if they decide to go under the PUD 5, and it will be their decision, this is an optional element, it's not for sure that they would do it, we need to give them incentives so that they could go forward and redevelop their property that's something that benefits the entire town and not just the property owners. So under the urbanistically contributing category, we've listed things that we love about this property and that they would have to save if they went forward with these incentives. Those would be the outside restaurant with the very quirky columns from 1947, the neon lights that are also signs that aren't allowed in the town of Palm Beach right now but would be grandfathered in and are part of the historic character of this space. The front room, which really tells a lot about mid-century dining in a beach resort in Palm Beach in the 1950s. Those are the things that we would like them to save. And the open space, remember they would have to do 30%. As we get to the back of the building, we'll see that the kitchen areas and the working areas of this restaurant are things that are not architecturally attractive or important for the pedestrian at all. And those are things that could be changed to make their operation work better for the restaurants and the other things that might be in here. I also point to your attention the little shingle-style building behind some of you. This is a building that may or may not be the town jail. The town jail was listed on a map of 1919, and although we're not sure, more research needs to be done, this building would have to be saved under the PUD 5. It could be moved somewhere else, but one of the things that we were also very lucky about in the PUD 5 is that the town hired a fellow named Stephen Muzan, who's an urban designer from Miami Beach, and he came and walked the street with all of us and developed some design guidelines for these streets. And one of the things that he said is important for a good pedestrian experience are small shops in a variety of different forms within a street rather than everything being uniform. I'm going to turn it back over to Mike.
Question, please. Which
Yes.
buildings on this street are historically zoned?
Which are landmark now. The only thing that is landmark now in the street is the Bradley House Hotel. That's the only thing. We tried in 2009 and 2012. It was brought before the Landmark Commission to landmark the whole street as a historic district. But the Landmark Commissioners decided, and I also concurred with that, every building on this street has been changed. If you have gone to the Historical Society and looked up pictures of Royal Poinciana Way, you would find that there's very little here, either from 1919, the Flagler area, or from the 1920s, which is the boom times of the 1920s before the hurricanes hit in 26 and 28. Also remember that this street doesn't look like it did when Henry Flagler was here because there was a railroad track across the street. So that although this is our main street and it was always a commercial town serving area, it does not have the architectural integrity that we would like for landmarks in the town of Palm Beach. One thing about that, the landmark ordinance in Palm Beach was developed in 1979. It was not popular when it was enacted. 9 out of the first 10 people who were proposed for landmarking sued the town. The only people that said yes were John Lennon and Yoko Ono, but it has served us well, and it's a great ordinance. But we could not get a historic district on Worth Avenue because there were too many changes, and I could not get a historic district passed on Pendleton because the town council said go after individual buildings that really meet the criteria and the heart of the ordinance rather than putting in things that don't do that.
I'm just going to spend, Jane, don't go far, because I'm going to toss it over to you for a second. I think it will be helpful to understand as we go through the street a little bit about Jane's contributing building report and what it does and what it doesn't do. It essentially breaks the buildings on the entire 5-acre block, both Royal Poinciana Way and Sunset, into 4 categories. And this is important for purposes of preservation, because the question was about landmarking. The only property that's landmarked now is Bradley House, but the idea is that there's a good deal of preservation here, voluntary preservation, and the level of preservation depends upon the category that each property fits into in the contributing building report. The contributing building report has 4 categories. The first is the highest, the architecturally and historically contributing. We'll see a few of those. The building on the corner meets that category. There's also an architecturally contributing category. Both corners meet that. The John Vogt wraparound, which we'll talk about later. Some of the other buildings, the building immediately west of the gas station where we were standing, is architecturally contributing. We'll talk about that when we get there. The third category is urbanistically contributing, and that's a term that Stephen Mouzon, our consultant from Miami, came up with. And that is a category where the building itself may not be architecturally or even historically significant, but similar to what Jane just described, the way the building meets the street, the way it depicts some of the history of the town. While some might say the Testa property is not an architecturally significant building, it does have significance to the town, and it does have significance to the street. So this building, the building itself, the restaurant, is urbanistically contributing. As I said earlier, the front of that restaurant would have to be saved, but there's a good bit of flexibility in the urbanistically contributing category. You cannot, as I said earlier, put 3 stories on urbanistically contributing buildings. None of the contributing buildings can have 3 stories. They can only be 2. You cannot put a 3rd story on top of that restaurant. Now, the 4th category is non-contributing. The gas station we were standing on is non-contributing. The bank building is non-contributing. And as we get back on the backside of Sunset, we'll see a few more that fit into that category. When we come through, there's a couple buildings as we get onto Sunset that are in the architecturally contributing category that Jane may want to talk about.
There were buildings that are architecturally contributing to the block, and they were buildings that, if they redevelop, they will have to renovate and save. I went to the Department of the Interior standards for historic restoration when I wrote the contributing building report, and the first thing that the standards encourage people to do is identify what's important. That's what this exercise was about. It's not that it's something that is to be used in the future. So the first you identify, then you retain what's important, and finally you can restore and redevelop what you need to save. I want you to look across the street, however, at the Royal Palm Travel building. This is what you would get under CTS zoning with underground parking. It's not what we're looking for as a historic contributor to the town of Palm Beach. Like Mike, I don't want to really comment so much on the building, but it's not what this historic Main Street block is all about. Also, if you look behind yourself, you can see the back of house at Testa's, what the restaurant back of house looks like, not only with the parking, but with the guts of what it takes to run an establishment like that. That's not something that needs to be saved if it can be redone in such a way that contributes to the next 50 years of working for that building. The Landmarks Commission has great experience with doing that. We replaced the siding on the Seagull Cottage and allowed them to put an addition on so that they could use it for the Sunday schools for the church. That saved a very important building in town while having it move forward for the next century. We've also done that in other areas in town, and it's something that could be done here as well.
Thanks, Jane. I'm going to try and get us back on the main street. One thing Jane mentioned that made me think of a point I want to not forget to make. Jane mentioned the Landmarks Commission. The way the PUD 5 is structured, all of the redevelopment goes through landmarks. The Landmarks Commission considers all proposals for PUD 5, and the Landmark Ordinance is the governing ordinance for consideration of any redevelopment. plus of course the zoning changes that are in the PUD 5. This is the back of the PNC Bank building. This is one of the non-contributing structures on the street. This is actually the only building on the street that complies with CTS zoning. This property, there's two parcels here that have been put together that make up 100 lineal feet on Sunset, and there's another parcel, as you can see up front, which also is 100 feet, but they don't quite match. As you'll see, that back building overlaps here, and this building here, which Jane will talk about in a minute, overlaps here. But altogether, you've got about a half an acre of land here. The bank building is 2,800 square feet of commercial space on a half acre. That's 14% lot coverage, and you've got 15 parking spaces here. The 15 parking spaces comply with what's required under the code for 2,800 square feet. As you can see, the lot coverage is less than 15%. 85% is either parking lot or drive aisles. The architecture of the building was deemed by everybody to be non-contributing. It was built in the mid-1970s. One of the aspects of it that I think is unappealing is that it has two curb cuts and automobiles driving across the sidewalk. And obviously they did not necessarily need to do that, but that works for their business. So this is, in my view, somewhat of a glimpse of what the future might be under CTS, because there's a substantial amount of parking required, as evidence here. Lou?
Yeah, Mike, there's been talk about developers coming in and massing parcels and doing that sort of thing. Is there a limit on the amount of acreage that
Yes.
a developer can use?
Question is there a limit? There is a limit under PUD 5. You cannot develop more than 1.5 acres. There is no such limit under CTS. Someone could buy the whole block, demolish everything except for the Bradley House, which is landmarked, and build something. You can't go more than 1.5 acres, but there are further limits beyond that under PUD 5, and that is, you'll find that there are architecturally and historically built contributing buildings scattered throughout the block. For example, this one here, Art Deco style from the 1950s. I'm going to let Jane talk about it in a second, but the point I want to make in response to Lou's question is, you can't tear that building down under PUD 5. So you can't tear that building down. The building right there on Poinciana Way, where the bullhorn is pointing, that was a building designed by Gustav Moss in 1945. A noted architect in this town, was a partner of John Volk for many years. It's a very nice building. It cannot be torn down under the PUD 5. It could be leveled under CTS. So you start to get the picture of someone trying to buy this property and redevelop it and go out in different directions. They're going to hit buildings that they can't tear down. They can buy them, but they can't tear them down. So the disbursement of the historic and architecturally contributing buildings throughout the block is also a check on massing of some sort of huge city place type of development. Jane, why don't we talk a little bit about...
Talk about density in these two buildings.
Okay. Well, I'll talk about density in these two buildings because we're looking at the two highest levels of density on the street. Right here, there's 12 condominium units on 0.135 acres. That works out to density of 88 units per acre. That's the highest density right now in the 5-acre area. 88 units per acre. Hey there. The Gus Moss building isn't much behind. That's 8 units on 1/8 of an acre. That works out to 64 units per acre. There are 8 residential units there. Some are on the first floor, some are on the second floor. It is the highest density that actually faces Royal Poinciana Way. I point that out simply because I know there's a very legitimate concern in the town about density, and I appreciate that and share that concern. The reason we picked 13 units per acre is that's the maximum permitted under the comprehensive plan, and we didn't want to go higher than that. But there currently is 64 units per acre. There's also another property that's 38, another property that's 60. On Royal Poinciana Way, this property's density levels of 88 units per acre. So 13 doesn't seem a lot compared to those numbers. Jane, you want to talk a little about the two buildings while we can see both of them?
Sure. One of the beauties of Royal Poinciana Way is the mixture of styles, and one of the things that's in the design guidelines that Stephen Mouzon talked about is that we shouldn't have a homogeneity of styles within this 5-acre block. I think that that will do a lot to allay the fears that we could have something develop like Meisner Park in Boca Raton or City Place. We don't want everything on this block to be a Mediterranean revival. We want the block and any redevelopment or restoration or reconstruction that happens to take its clue from the different architecture that grew up over time. This Gustav Moss building is post-war. There was a moratorium on building during World War II, and this is one of the first ones in the town that Mr. Moss did after that moratorium was lifted. The building behind me is from the 1950s, and it takes its clue from some of the mid-century modern things that are now being saved and restored in Miami Beach. There are things like planter boxes by the front streetscape to bring the greenery out to the pedestrian walkers, and wrapping windows around corners to encourage cross ventilation in rooms. These are things that are important and that any other redevelopment and reconstruction would happen. The other thing I want to say is I've heard a lot about we shouldn't do anything to change the comprehensive plan. Historically, the first comprehensive plan in the town of Palm Beach was financed by the Garden Club. I see some Garden Club people here, and it's a beautiful plan, and the renderings from that plan are in the town manager's office. Very few of the things that were called for under that plan, however, were materialized because they were very grand, some of the schemes in that plan. But it was a good start. The present comprehensive plan was enacted in 1989, and it's been changed a number of times since then. As a matter of fact, it's a document that's meant to be looked at and added to as the community's desires and needs change. I know that for a fact because in 1996, I got a grant from the state of Florida to add a historic preservation element to that comprehensive plan. And I wrote that element for the comp plan, and it was adopted by the town council.
I'm going to walk back through the alleyway to the end and maybe ask everyone to just sort of come down the little alleyway, take a real quick peek on this courtyard in the back, which is very pretty, and which I'll talk about in a minute in terms of what could happen under PUD 5. Well, actually, I'll talk about it now because we're going to be cramped on space there. I mean, essentially, that building is, in my view, one of the buildings that could most benefit from PUD 5. The building could be restored; it wouldn't be torn down. The density levels would go from 8 to 2. So there'd be a reduction in density of 6 units if they developed under PUD 5. The first floor residential that you see now would become retail. It would become retail because, remember, we have no parking requirements for retail. And the idea is to encourage first floor retail. So my vision of that, and it's just my vision, I don't own the property obviously, would be that you perhaps expand that little via that goes to the back courtyard, expand that courtyard a bit, have a lot of first floor retail there, and just change that, put the residential upstairs, which would have to be on the second floor, could not be on the first floor, and have a lot of retail space in that courtyard, and reduce the density there from 8 to 2 units, a reduction of 6. So why don't we go there to the front of that building, and then we'll sort of shuttle back down the via, and hopefully they won't mind, and then we can reconvene perhaps on the other side of the bank building.
I'll talk a little bit about the buildings that are here. This building skirting around and P. Goodwin are buildings that are urbanistically contributing to the street. They are not architecturally contributing. Well, why is that? That looks like a parapet from the 1920s. Well, you can easily see that above the sign that says skirting around, there used to be another window. This building doesn't have its architectural integrity. But these two buildings and the building Island Home that some of you are standing under the awnings have an important lesson to teach for the redevelopment of Royal Poinciana Way, and it's something that Stephen Mouzon, the designer from Miami, incorporated in the design guidelines. What he likes and is great for pedestrian friendliness is storefronts that have 60% glass so that you can look into the windows and see what merchandise and things that there are to sell. So that's one of the things that we're encouraging to people to do in any of the redevelopment. Also in Island Home, There's transit lights above the awnings. These let light into the space without detracting from the awning that covers you from the sun as you walk down the street. The key is to make this block pedestrian friendly. And it's not an easy task because the block is 980 linear feet. That's a really big block. And again, that comes down to the fact that this was where the railroad dropped you off before you walked over to the Royal Poinciana Hotel that was right over there where the Slat House is. 1,150 rooms in the largest wood frame structure in the world, demolished. But remnants of it left, but people got off here and then were taken over to the hotel. So they got glimpses of things along here, and we want to keep that. So it's good retail, it's good for pedestrians, and curb cuts and things like the driveways in the bank interrupt that flow of people and make it so you don't really want to walk the street as much at night when you might be here dining or having some other, shopping experience or something that would be good for the town.
7 residential units now. There's some on the first floor, some on the second floor. I think 4 on the first floor, 3 on the first floor, and 4 on the second floor. If they developed into PUD 5, they would have to reduce the density from 7 to 2, which would essentially probably be 1 upstairs there and 1 upstairs somewhere on the east side of this property. Steve Muzan, the design guru that we hired, his vision of this was to go back about 5 or 10 feet down that via, expand it a bit, open it up, and have retail off the via facing into a courtyard. There's actually a little courtyard back there. There's a break in this building with a little courtyard and then a one-story studio or one-bedroom apartment. To basically sort of, when you go up in the back there, sort of clean that up, open that up, and have retail space opening up onto a courtyard. Perhaps 2 apartments on the top, 1 there and 1 there. If you develop, this is a property that I look at under CTS and sort of scratch my head because they have no access to Peruvian. It's a property that if we're developed under CTS, you would have to put a drive aisle to put parking here. The parking that would be required under CTS just for the shops that are here right now is over 20 parking spaces. And I guess you could put them in the back, but I'd rather have them in the back than the front, obviously, but there would be a substantial amount of parking just to meet the existing retail space that's here. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at the property, go back there. It's a narrow little archway, little alleyway, but I encourage you to go back and see what's back there and try and envision it possibly opened up a bit as you get further back with a courtyard back there and possibly some retail. There's also some empty space behind the island home, which could also be developed for retail. Yeah.
You've actually described kind of your view of what could happen from a property owner's perspective on this building and on the Moss building.
Right.
Have you had a reaction to that sort of discussion from the property owners as to see whether it's feasible?
Well, you have to talk to the property owner, Les Evans, because he's here and he can answer your question. The property that we just looked at, the Gus Moss building, is owned by an absentee landlord. Lives in California. So I have not had that discussion. I think everyone's waiting to see what the rules of the game are before they get too far down the road in terms of planning, probably testers included.
What is the setback? Is it as far back as it is now, or does this come forward because you have the grass?
Setback would be basically the same.
Exactly the same.
Yeah, either under CTS or under PUD 5. Setback won't matter. You could go to a second story over there, but setbacks would be the same.
That it's urbanistically contributing rather than historically. It's been so altered. The balcony on the front of it is new. The lattice work is new. Those were both added in the 1970s. But look at it a new way. Look at the parapet at the roof line, and there's a Della Robbia plaque feature that's up there. That's probably Meisner Industries that he manufactured to look like he was bringing old world things to Palm Beach, and he made quite a good living with his Meisner Industries. The other thing I want to say is that a lot of people have talked about and worried about the fact that some of these buildings that are urbanistically contributing might only have a facade that's saved. This is not unusual for the town of Palm Beach. with over 200 landmark properties in the town, there's still 28 buildings that only have a partial designation, whether it be the front facade or a front door. In particular, look at the First National Bank. The First National Bank is just a great set of buildings, but it's only protected back to the first 15 feet of the buildings. That gave the bank flexibility. Landmarks works with owners. Our ordinance doesn't require owner consent in order to landmark something, but we've never come down hard with people with a hammer. We try and work with them so that something is a win for the town and a win for the property owners.
Okay, we're just gonna go a little bit of distance here to the Breakers parking lot. There's some provisions that are pretty specific to that parcel I want to talk about, so let's move over just a little bit here. And one of the things we really wrestled with on the committee was how to make this street as pedestrian-friendly, walkable, both daytime and night as possible. And this parking lot really kind of stood out. The building itself is urbanistically contributing. The way it meets the street is important. It connects to a one-story commercial space back there. The Breakers now owns it. There are 15 parking spaces here. If you were to put the number of parking spaces required for the commercial use that it has now, you would have to require over 40 parking spaces. They have 15. Now, how do we deal with this parking lot? There's a provision in the PUD 5 that says if you have a parking lot on Raw Poinciana Way, and right now this is the only one, but the Testa gas station could become that, and you take that and you convert 30% to public open space, you can take the other 70% and put first floor, one-story, front-facing retail without requiring parking for that retail. So there's a provision that would allow the Breakers or whoever owns this parking lot to take, and this parking lot, by the way, is 65 by 105 feet. So you could take that parcel of property, you could put 30% public open space, would probably be a opening to a via right where everyone is standing, coming in here, going back there, and have shops along here. And the idea is to, again, encourage the retail by giving the break on parking, get 30% public open space, perhaps the shops would open to the back as well, and make a nice little courtyard there, but also take care of what is a black hole right now as you walk the street at night, and you go from Sprinkles, which is alive, and you go to Cucina, which is alive, and then you kind of have this spot in. So I don't know whether the Breakers will ever do that or not, or anyone ever will, but it's certainly something that we try to encourage, getting rid of the parking lot, getting rid of the curb cut. I've mentioned curb cuts a number of times. If you develop under PUD 5, you have to get rid of the curb cuts. Obviously, people have curb cuts, so they don't want to use PUD 5. They can keep their curb cuts. But the hope is that if PUD 5 is developed, you'll get rid of these curb cuts. And if you walk the street, sometimes notice how many parking spaces you'd pick up on the street if you got rid of these curb cuts. There's quite a few. It'd be quite an addition to the off-street, the on-street parking if you got rid of these curb cuts. So that's what's sort of unique to this property. Again, I think this is a property that could someday significantly benefit from the PUD 5, and the town could, because we would end up perhaps with some nice shops here instead of a parking lot. Jay can talk about the significance of the building. I will simply say it is architecturally and historically significant, cannot be torn down. If someone bought this property and tried to develop under PUD 5, they would have to keep the building. Obviously under CTS there's no protection, it could be torn down at any time. But this building under PUD 5 could not be torn down. Now we've walked the street and you've seen a number of buildings I've said that about. You start to get the picture that they're just interspersed all over the place, which would, I think, prevent a lot of massing of properties, as some people have been concerned. Jane, you want to talk about the building?
Well, I'm back to the Henry Flagler era, maybe a little bit. Well, I'm back to the Henry Flagler era, perhaps a little bit later. This building is on a 1919 Florida Sanborn map. Those were fire insurance maps. They're a good historical tool. And when you look at that map, which is part of the contributing building report, you see that the block was always mixed use. There was always there was always residential on the street. And you can see that it wasn't nearly as urbanistically developed in 1919. But this building was there in this footprint in 1919. Across the street in the park was E.R. Bradley's Casino, so you could walk over there and partake of some of the illegal gambling that was going on, and perhaps have an afternoon cocktail or two. Also, what's important about this building is the first post office in the town of Palm Beach was here. The town hall was across the street in the median. The post office that's at the end of the street was not developed until 1935. That was a WPA project, and it coincided with taking out the railroad tracks that came down the middle and giving us our beautiful green space in the middle of the street. Bradley House is landmarked. Everything that happens to this building goes before the Landmark Preservation Commission, which is the commission that would also take any applications that were redeveloped under the PUD 5. The building was designed in 1924 by Martin Luther Hampton. He's not an architect we know a lot about. He hasn't done a lot of other things in town, but it's a beautiful building and it's a great representation of the Mediterranean Revival style during those boom times. Remember that the boom times only last in Florida until after the 1928 hurricane. Then all of our banks collapsed in Florida and real estate prices took a dive, and so we get different architectural changes as that happens. So some things do repeat themselves. Island Animal Hospital is an American four-square building. It was one of the most popular domestic styles of architecture in the teen years, and it's a rare example of this still left in the town. Remember, we have no Mediterranean revival until Addison Meisner gets here in 1919 and designs the Everglades Club. Probably the front porch was originally open on this building, but it couldn't have another story on it. It's architecturally contributing to the town. We don't know who the architect is, but there are so few of these four squares left in town, it would be great to keep it. The other thing to look closely at in this, and why it's different than the properties on Royal Poinciana Way, is it's set back from the street with a small front yard. It would be also important to keep that in any redevelopment or adaptive reuse of this building as the owner went forward.
Under PUD 5, you have a concept of equivalency that is used, which means you have to replicate the parking you have. You don't have to do any first floor retail parking, but you do have to replicate what you have. So if you've got parking now, you're going to have to keep it. If Test is developed, they've got about 40 spaces, they're going to have to keep those somewhere underground. Now, if you demolish a building under CTS, you have to bring it to code. Cucina has got about 20 parking spaces there. That's not enough as required for that restaurant under CTS. They'd have to have substantially more parking than that. So if the building were torn down, it would have to be brought to code, and that parking lot would have to either be expanded or they'd have to get a variance on parking. Under PUD 5, if you've got 20 spaces there, you're going to have to replicate those spaces. You're not going to be able to get rid of the spaces in the back here under the PUD 5. So they would have to be replicated somehow. Now, we're in front of a building that is a non-contributing building. It was built more recently, and it was obviously built to take advantage to accommodate the parking requirements for an office, for a dentist office, and that's why you've got the building essentially up on stilts with a parking on the first floor. This building is a non-contributing building under PUD 5. It could be torn down and developed in some other fashion that would be consistent with the rest of the block. The two buildings we just passed are non-contributing buildings. They were built in the 1950s. They could be torn down. Everything else we're going to see as we walk around is contributing. Jane's going to talk a little bit about it. This was a John Volk wraparound. And the only thing I'll say with respect to development of this parcel, if you take this entire parcel, which begins at the end of the Testa property and comes east, and goes to around Nick and Johnny's, the old auction house, it's a bookstore, and the little shop next to it, that's about 9/10 of an acre. If it were all developed as one parcel, it would require about 11,000 square feet of public open space, which would probably mean these two buildings would come down, this via would be expanded, there would be an access out to Royal Poinciana Way. I'm not going to get into whether the likelihood of that happening and what the incentives would be. I think it's a little bit challenging, but there would be about 11,000 square feet of public open space on this if it were all developed as one. It's actually owned by one owner, but there are several different parcels and different tax ID numbers that make up this property. So they are not necessarily, there's not unity of title on this property now, but these two buildings take up about 10,000 square feet and they could be demolished. The rest of the buildings on this property, Nick and Johnny's, everything we're going to walk around on the corner cannot be. And I'll let Jane, you want to talk about that now, or I'll just out on to get to Poinciana Way?
I just want everybody to take notice of how buildings change over time. If you look in this courtyard and you look up on the second floor, you see some curved columns that are Mediterranean revival in style. That indicates to me that this was an earlier building. In 1941, John Volk wrapped the Art Deco facade around on County Road and on Royal Poinciana Way. He did that because County Road was being widened and they had to take down the portico that extended into County Road right now. So their solution was to completely change the architecture. He did that in 1941. Also, look across the street at the synagogue. That building is only a facade designation, but they did a beautiful job with landmarks, approval and everything.
These are architecturally contributing buildings from where I'm standing to where we were standing last. And under the PUD 5, they cannot be torn down. They cannot have a third story on them. They would have to be preserved under the PUD 5 and could not be demolished. Under CTS, they could be demolished. But under PUD 5, they would have to be preserved.
One of the reasons we love Royal Poinciana Way is all this variation of style and height. And that's something that Stephen Mouzon's anticipated in the design guidelines. He talks about how buildings meet each other, and you can see here that it's not one straight shot all the way across on these three buildings. These three buildings are three of the most important buildings on the street, both architecturally and historically. The building in front of us, the Palm Beach Bookstore, is Neoclassical Revival. We don't know who the architect was with that, but it was originally the Garden Theater, and there's some great old pictures of the marquee and the old movie theater that was here. The Nick and Johnny's was designed by William Manley King in 1927. William Manley King is important because he was the school board architect, and so our Palm Beach Public School and the school across the street that the Society of the Four Arts just renovated were William Manley King designs. So this is another example of what he would do with commercial architects. Look under at the archways and the pointed arches and transoms above. The capitals on those pillars are also very important. They're organically, almost like flowers, rather than any of the classical orders of capitals. And the building on the street, as I told you on the other side, is an Art Deco wraparound that John Volk did in 1941 to solve a very practical problem of widening Royal Poinciana Way. Someone asked me about the post office at the end of the street. That's locally landmarked and on the National Register of Historic Places. Before it was sold by the post office, Landmarks had to sign off on anything that would happen to it. So Landmarks has a lot of experience in dealing with complicated problems in commercial architecture as well as residential architecture. And I think that they are the perfect body to go ahead and review anything in the PUD 5. I know that there are some people that are questioning that, but I challenge you to look in the Town Hall Square Historic District and look at the difference between the police station, which was designed without landmark input, and the fire station, which was designed with landmark input. And it was landmarks that encouraged the architect to put the portico around the front of that building to mimic the Harvey and Clark portico at the other end of the block. So Landmarks does their homework, and I can't say enough good things about them.
I have a question. On all of these ones that can't be torn down, are there incentives from the state or from the town, from the feds, anything? Are there tax incentives?
If a property owner decides to go ahead and develop under the PUD 5, it would be to their advantage to voluntarily landmark their building. then they can take advantage of the tax abatement program that was started in the town in 1997 and has been very successful in shielding increases in property taxes on the amount of money you spend on rehabbing a building. For example, on the bookstore building, none of those windows are original on the second floor, and if someone wanted to redo that and do it with impact-resistant windows, Landmarks would probably encourage that. They would look at old photographs, see what was important for the style. There are also federal incentives, 20% of what you spend, but if it's the federal incentives that the property owner wants to go after, they have to get those plans not just approved by Landmarks, but also at the state, at the SHPO office.
I'm going to have to finish up here. There was a question, though, I want to answer for everybody. The question was whether you could put a third story here under PD 5. You cannot, but could you under CTS? And the answer is you cannot as of right. You would have to ask for a variance. And you could ask for a variance under CTS to put a third story on frankly, anything along here. We have a provision in the PUD 5 that says there are no variances allowed on certain things. In addition to density, which is town-wide, you cannot get a density on height. You cannot get a density a variance on height, on overall height, and you cannot get a variance on the public open space. So there's pretty tight limits, and also on the 1.5 acre limitation. There are no variances on that, sure.
Can, under the CT, whatever, can it be torn down?
Yes, under CTS this could be torn down. Everything on this street we've seen could be torn down tomorrow under CTS. I have got to conclude my portion of the tour. I've got a very important appointment. I've got to go join my wife's birthday celebration. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I really appreciate the interest that everyone has shown. Nancy?
You guys were wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank Jane Day, who is not here on the clock. She believes in this, and so she volunteered to come up and talk.
Jane.
And she's going to answer any further questions by the gas station about the preservation component of this, but I'm going to have to scoot. Ned, thanks very much for organizing
Thank you
this.
so much for doing it. It was really
I think we've lost a lot of our people, but is there anyone here who has real serious questions about this PUD 5? And if, yes.
No, I just, one of the questions I have is, you're putting all this retail space and you're taking away the parking. So how are people supposed to get to the retail space if you don't have any parking?
Bob Moore, I might ask you to answer parking questions. Bob Moore is the former building official.
Has there been a parking study done? And if you want all these people to go to use the retail space, how are they going to get there if there is no parking for retail?
One of the benefits of this street, the way it's configured, is that it has public parking on both sides of it. You have the breakers on the south side, which has its own planned unit development, but there's no commercial that has been approved for the south side of the street. So in essence, both sides of the street are public parking for all of the retail. Plus, if you're putting in redevelopment, you must provide the parking that would be required for the redevelopment.
But not for not if it is an establishment, if it's a retail establishment. You said you didn't have to provide parking.
Well, you have to provide parking if you're tearing down the building. Retail on the first floor, no, but on the second or third floor, if you are using a special exception to go to the third floor.
The first floor, you don't have.
That's correct, and that's because of the configuration of the street. There are over 250 parking spaces on the street.
Is that enough?
It is according to the town.
And has there been a study?
Yes, sure.
And is that study available?
I believe it's with the Paul Castro or John Lindgren.
Can I follow up on that? Mr. Pucillo had said that you don't have to provide parking for first floor retail, but I also heard him say that you would have to replicate the existing parking. So if that's true, does that mean there would not be a net loss of spaces? He said under PUD you'd have to replicate the existing on-site parking.
That is correct.
So even though you wouldn't have to provide parking for retail, first floor retail, you still wouldn't have a net loss of spaces?
That is my understanding of the PUD 5 for the reconstruction.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I represent some people on Sunset Avenue, and their big concern is if you're eliminating all the curb cuts and all the parking off of Poinciana, then you're forcing all of that traffic to Sunset, turning Sunset into even just a bigger parking lot and more traffic where we have the enlarged Publix, and we have quite a few parking lots already now. You're going to force all the rest of that over to Sunset, a street that historically has had a lot of traffic problems, both at Sunset and County and at Bradley and Sunset. So how do you see that working out for those people who traffic along Sunset Avenue or live there?
Parking is not my expertise. I'm a historic preservationist. That's why I called on Bob Moore, who was the person that hired me in 1992. But I will say this, I have worked with Stephen Mouzon, who is this urban planner from Miami, and if this passes, I believe that he's scheduled to come up and give a design workshop with everyone that's interested. He did some sketches when he was here about how to get the parking inside so that it doesn't negatively impact the people on Sunset, because he saw that right away. And we just thought, because each individual property owner will have to decide if they want to go forward with PUD or not. It's hard to make a one-size-fits-all determination. Remember that if anybody redevelops under this, it's going to have to go to town council and to landmarks and to planning and zoning, so that there will be reviews all the way along for those concerns.
It's not clear to me that when the PUD will be voted on next week, anybody who owns property can still redevelop under the CTS?
That's correct.
Even after the PUD is passed, or the PUD?
It's an optional element in the code. And what it does is, in exchange for the historic preservation elements, and I bullet pointed them with the help of the committee underneath a photograph of each building on the street, the property owner can decide what's more advantageous to them as they go forward. We're trying to give all the incentives we can, and certainly any property owner that wanted to do that, I would encourage them to voluntarily landmark their property and take advantage of the tax abatement that saves Town of Palm Beach taxes, county taxes. It exempts the school board. The school board always gets their bite of the apple. But it's been a real good program for the town, and it's very owner friendly, because all your reviews are at the Landmark Commission in the Town of Palm Beach rather than going up to Tallahassee.
Just one more question that I have is there any thought in this PUD plan that takes into effect the PUD across the street for the breakers, which is apparently a big development which may or may not ever happen?
What's at issue here is the redevelopment of the Royal Poinciana Way on the north side. The Breakers has their own plan unit development since the mid-1970s down on the south side. There is no commercial within that plan unit development on the south side. So the town has certainly taken that into consideration when it initially voted to go ahead and make this an option and submit the changes for the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance. So yes, it has.
But Bob, I heard something the other day that I didn't realize, and that is the PUD that has been approved, or the plan that's been approved for the breakers, only includes 31 units. I think it's 31, I may be wrong, on this property. The rest of it is across County Road. Do you know that?
I hesitate to give too definitive an answer on this, because the Breakers has a right of moving units within their property, both sides of the road. They can relocate them. They would have to come to the Planning and Zoning Commission. They would have to come to the Town Council, but they can relocate them. And the 31 units Dudley Moore is talking about would be located on the corner where the parking lot is. If, in fact, the parking lot was abandoned, then they would have to, for in favor of the 31 units, they would have to reproduce that parking on the east side of the road, across from to the northwest of the main entrance in their parking lot by way of a parking garage.
What are the banks here doing with respect to the Community Reinvestment Act, where they're obligated to put money into things like this? Do you know anything about that?
I do not.
Yeah, but my guess is they're gonna wait to see what happens with this.
But they would have an obligation to lend money for development purposes or rehabilitation.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for walking around the